Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and A.J. Mathieu.
All right, welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. This is episode 48. Is that right, AJ?
That's right.
Man, welcome to episode 48. Today, we are talking about the COVID exposure. Now, we're not meaning that the exposure of you individually to COVID, although hopefully you have managed to avoid that kind of exposure as well. But we're talking about the exposure of the church that COVID has brought. There's been a lot of research that's come out from Barna. They've done a really good job, I think, of communicating some of the changes that have come as a result of COVID. But I think Carrie Nieuwhof actually had an article similar to this topic, talking about how COVID didn't create problems, it simply exposed them. And the changes that we're seeing in the church that we're about to dive in and talk about in just a second, they're not changes that COVID created. They're just changes that COVID accelerated.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in church, as we're going to talk about today, they pre-exist COVID. They were the church's pre-existing condition that COVID has. It was a comorbidity.
Comorbidity. There, that's the term of the day. Yeah.
And COVID has essentially just brought the consequences of these challenges to the fore. And so today we want to talk a little bit about what it is that COVID has exposed and how do we move forward from here. Because unlike COVID, which we're still not sure what kind of medicines or treatments there is a treatment for the sickness in the church and for the decline that we've seen in the church. And so we want to talk about that and how you can move forward in a healthy way. But I'm joined, as always, by A.J. Mathieu. A.J., how are you today?
Doing well, Scott. Great to be back this week again.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about this research that's come out from Barna and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. And, so also to set this up and, truth in advertising, their research, there's always a little bit of a lag. So the results that we have out of their most recent articles around the topic of attendance online and what the church was experiencing comes from a sample that they did in like the end of April and into May. And so, we're a month and a half behind on this. I don't think we would probably find, if they were able to update it tomorrow and give us the results the next day, I don't think we would probably see better results.
I was going to say, there's a chance that it could be worse. I doubt that it's better.
It's probably not better. And so kind of the main thing that I kind of latched onto in reading this was this result that they found, in which a third of what they refer to as practicing Christians, which unfortunately are only people that attend at least once a month a worship service at some church. We would love to understand that practicing Christians were more committed to that in attending worship services. But so we're already dealing with a population that doesn't go to church that often, but a third of them now stopped or never even attended anything online. So, most churches shut down in March and into early April. And, they took a sample about a month later then, when probably no church was meeting online, save for just a few that were in the news, of course. And there was a third of the people that never even tuned in at all. And most likely they probably still have not, or probably similar sample would have not still attended. So, that just right there is like, what does that mean? Who are these people? Why was it that they were attending in person at least once a month, and then when this happened, they totally checked out?
Yeah.
And, I think, Scott, you and I agree on this for the most part. We don't know all these people. We don't know the heart of all these people. And only 1,000 were sampled in the United States. Okay. So, but this is, a pretty typical sample size anyway. Were they ever really that committed to begin with? I think that was the question that you and I talk about offline all the time,
Yeah. I actually saw a little debate on Facebook just today. I won't share any names of who was having the debate, but it was bringing up this exact piece of uh, data from Barna, and um, the discussion was essentially, well, people are it's just decentralized, and people are still consuming, so to speak, consuming Christian content, but aren't necessarily affiliating themselves with any particular church. And the way this was sort of pitched was like it's an okay thing. But that's not true, because if all church ever was in the first place was a place to hear a sermon or to
Hmm.
sing a few songs,
Yeah.
then maybe there isn't any reason to fear, because people are continuing to consume Christian content online.
Yeah.
But this is the problem, and I don't blame um I don't blame the big church down the street. I blame every single church, including the small ones, that have framed the Christian experience as essentially just go and hear a sermon.
Hmm.
When it's just around content, people are realizing there's better content than what your local church can put out.
Yeah.
When it's not about genuine discipleship and relationship, which can't be duplicated by downloading a podcast
Hmm.
or putting a playlist on your phone on Spotify, um, then it's no wonder that people walk away from it, because
Yeah.
there was no relationship there. There was no genuine discipleship there.
Yeah.
And I believe that to some degree, that's what COVID has exposed, is that all it was to at least a third of people was content.
Right.
And it's easy to tune out content because we're
Yeah.
in such a content heavy society anymore.
Especially when you're at home. I mean, same study showed that 15% of people who did tune in, so not the 33% who weren't there, but the remaining 66%, 15% of them were multitasking while they're watching church. And then I think these other two stats also show kind of a commitment and level of maturity and discipleship component as well, that 64% of the people that were watching church online, 64% only prayed along with a prayer happening during the service, and only
Mhm.
40% would sing along with the music. So,
Right.
I think those are some other telling numbers to what's going on in the psyche of the person that is consuming church online, what they're there for, and what they're maybe getting out of it even then. So
Let me play
really
devil's
interesting
advocate
numbers.
a little bit and just cut people a little bit of slack, to some degree. I will fully admit I'd be included in the numbers of people who are not sitting there singing along, or watching live even. Like, I'm totally guilty of, I'll go back, and I won't watch it on Sunday. I'll listen on Tuesday, to just the sermon, because I'm not necessarily tuning in to the music.
Yeah.
So like I'm as guilty as anybody of that. But I think that we're on the wrong track even, and this is what to kind of pivot to the where we want to go for the bulk of this episode, AJ. Um, I think that if we're hung up on are people watching the content live and are they singing along, we've missed what discipleship is, because we're playing into that game of, well, if people would just tune into the content when it's happening live,
Yeah. Yeah.
and singing along, then that would mean that they're really a disciple. Now, I agree that if people aren't tuning in, they're not listening, then the chances of them doing the other discipleship things is also small.
Right.
But we don't want to get caught in the trap of thinking if people would just watch live or, just sing along, then they would be ticking the discipleship boxes, because that's
Absolutely.
playing
Yeah.
into the sickness that got us to where we are right now in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. Totally with you on that. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
So let's
There's,
pivot then. So how do we move forward from here then? What do we need to do?
yeah. Well, this week, I mean, we've got three things kind of laid out in this week's article, that need to be re-examined, I think, in the church. And these we could have written the same thing a year ago. No one had heard of COVID-19, but it applies this year, as much or more than ever. So let's just kind of walk through these three things that we're saying need to be re-examined. First, are we set up to systematically move people into greater maturity in the church? And so we're talking about a, a, a strategic discipleship pathway in the
Hmm.
church. That's a term that probably a lot of people have heard at this point. A lot of church leaders, discipleship pathway. And this is a strategic methodology in the church for setting up our ministries to move people from point A to point B, point C, and on to just, a discipled life that's constantly growing in maturity. Because a discipled life growing in maturity is a life constantly changing for the better, conforming more so to Christ likeness.
Yeah.
It's our sanctification. And so, which is the function of the church. One function of the church is to aid in people doing that. There's responsibility on our part as individuals. There's responsibility that the Holy Spirit takes, and there's responsibility of the church as the church, as an organization, to help foster that. So that's the first thing, Scott, is do we have a system in place to help people mature in the faith?
This is a really good thought, and I think that this is a critical question because it gets to the heart of, are we actually discipling people?
Yeah.
I think that what COVID has done is that it has, one of the things that it's exposed is our addiction to the first step in a discipleship pathway, which would be some sort of a gather step or a know step, a worship step, something centered around the worship service itself. And so many churches have been consumed with, what is our online attendance? What, how many people are watching? How many people are tuning in? How many people are downloading or whatever? Which ties into that same obsession that we saw with in person. How many rear ends are we getting in seats? And very rarely did the questions go beyond that. Like, it only mattered, and this shows it's just straight up vanity metric, like for a pastor and for leadership teams to go, man, we got this many people to tune in, we got this many people to show up to this event or this thing. And it doesn't get to the heart of the question you're asking, which is, are we systematically moving people and engaging people into greater spiritual maturity? And as I've been working with churches post-COVID, this is a serious question that we are diving deeper and deeper into, more than we ever have before, of really moving people. And I love the word systematically into greater maturity. We, something that the Holy Spirit kind of put on my heart lately, is the parable of the lost sheep. I know you and I have talked about this, but have we talked about this on the podcast?
I don't think we have. Not that I can recall. Yeah.
So I always, I don't have it pulled up, but I believe that the parable starts like, what shepherd who has 100 sheep, if he has one that strays off, wouldn't leave the 99 and go for the one. So this is kind of the premise. Like, what shepherd wouldn't? We always read this as like, wow, what amazing love of God, what incredible, compassion that the shepherd has for the sheep, that he would leave the 99. Well, the reason he can leave the 99 is because the 99 are in the fold. They're sort of within the structure of safety. And then, which gives the shepherd the ability, and not just the ability, but the responsibility, the onus to go and find the one. And what we see in churches, this goes back to the question you're asking, AJ, and really kind of pivots us to number 2, is if we don't have the systematic structure to know where the 99 are, then we don't know who the one is that's disconnected. So if you're listening to this, pastor, and you're going, I don't know what's happened to my people, that 30% stat connects with me. Do you know who those 30% are that have totally disconnected? Could you name them?
Yeah.
How would you know? Do you have a way of knowing which of the 99 are in the fold and which of the one has escaped from the fold? Because if you don't, then that's problem number 1, is you don't have boundary lines to know who the 99 are who are safe.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that is a good kind of segue into number 2. The second question that we're asking this week is, do we have a leadership structure to accomplish the goals? The goals being, refer back to number 1, systematically helping people mature in their faith. And so I love the parable that you've brought up for this, Scott. This other statistic out of the Barna study is that 30% of people that are still engaged practicing Christians have had no contact with a church leader in the last month. So And now this is a two-way street, though.
Hmm.
I mean, if people have a need, I think people need to reach out. But I also think there's a responsibility on part of church leadership to, again, know who's the 99 and who's the one.
Right.
And so, this brings up a necessity to have a leadership structure in which we can keep up with our 100, right?
Yeah, but
So
let
that
me
we,
let me push on that a little bit. I know it's a two-way street. I'm not saying that individuals don't have any responsibility for their
yeah,
lives. I'm not saying that. But who are the under shepherd and who are the sheep in this?
yeah,
And the burden is greater on who? The sheep or the under shepherds.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if it was greater on the sheep, then the one would never have wanted off. He would have been like, "Hey, shepherd, I need some help over here." So,
Right.
yeah, more so on the church. I would have to say more so on the church. Um, and so, of course, now the pastor, the single staff pastor listening to this is like, how do I keep up with everybody? And that brings us now into part, what we referred to in this question, leadership structure, not
Mhm.
leader, singular.
Yeah.
Regardless of the size of your church, you're never so small that you don't need a leadership structure, that you don't need
Yeah.
other people around you that are picking up and doing this work with you. And of course, they're lay leaders. Of course, they're not all going to be staff people, staff pastors, people with titles, people with seminary degrees. But that's not what's needed. That's not what's needed to effectively manage the flock alongside you, and in making sure that people are known and that people are cared for and that people are in the fold.
Yeah, I have a church that I'm meeting with next week who this is an exact challenge they're trying to navigate. They are making some significant changes, partly due to COVID, partly some of these changes predate COVID, and they are specifically trying to tackle this. COVID has exposed within their church their inability is maybe not the right word, or the gaps in their pastoral care, that it really was relying on just the pastor to get it all done. And now they're wanting to see a new way of doing this that spreads the load out so that care can happen at a um, more effectively, I guess, by sharing that leadership load and by developing that leadership structure, they can make sure that all the sheep get cared for. So
Hmm.
that's critically important to work on. So I guess first you need that system. You need a way
Hmm.
for tracking to know who's in the fold and who's not, and then you need people to come alongside you, more under shepherds. We know the good shepherd is Jesus Christ, but we serve as under shepherds under him, and you can't do it alone. You need others to serve alongside you. Okay, so
Hmm.
then the third and final question here, AJ, is how do we know how to measure progress? How do we know that the changes that we've made from in the system and the changes that we've made in the leadership structure are having any real impact on the results? Are we doing a better job?
Yeah, right. We've got to figure out the right things to measure so that we can determine whether our efforts have the output that we desire them to have.
Hmm.
And so this brings us back to, some of the initial conversation here on attendance. Don't stop measuring attendance. And if you're not measuring attendance, start. But that's not the end of what we're trying to determine.
Hmm.
That's just one little indicator that might be a barometer for what's happening in our church. We've got to be figuring out ways to measure our outputs. What's our output? Maturity of people growing in their faith of Jesus Christ. So if we have a system, then that's what we have to have a system to know how we can measure. And based on whatever your system is, then there'll be custom measures for you. But we've got to be measuring outputs. We have to dive deeper into the results. We've got to be in people's lives, not in a way that's smothering, but we've got to know people. If we've got, again, a leadership structure and we've got maybe small groups in our church, that small group leader should have his finger on the pulse of his people.
Hmm.
Those are the relationships. That's the biblical fellowship that would come from a system like that, in which we would know how people are truly doing. And that's where we can begin to have some measurements that will tell us whether we're actually accomplishing a maturing in the faith that we really desire.
Yeah. So when we work with the church one on one, we first kind of map out how is it that we're going to structure our ministries, that discipleship pathway. We create the systems for moving people from step to step. Then we ask the churches to select one critical number for each step in that discipleship pathway. It doesn't mean that nothing else matters. It doesn't mean that it's the only thing we measure, but it does mean that this is the proof that we're making the progress that we want to see. And so you need to have some sort of static measurement to know, are we going fast? Are we going slow? Are we improving or are we not? In each of the steps in your discipleship pathway. So don't be afraid to have those measurements. It's really key.
So let's just recap what we talked about today, Scott. First, it was three questions that we're asking. Are we set up to systematically move people into greater maturity in our church? Do we really have a framework for people to mature? Have we cut out the fluff that really isn't doing anything and that people probably can't even participate in right now? And are we just really honing in on some core elements? Number two,
And sorry, and to interrupt you real fast, and included in that, are we only obsessed about the first sort of layer, which is,
yeah, right. Yeah.
Just getting people to show up for a sermon, or do we really care about moving them past that first level of engagement? Sorry, keep going.
Absolutely. There's much more to go after that. Number two was, do we have the leadership structure to accomplish our goals?
Mm-hmm.
So it takes more than the solo pastor to really make this happen. And so for you larger church folks, you're set up well. Maybe you're not actually maximizing.
Maybe not.
Maybe you're not maximizing. But so, this is a question to ask yourselves. Are we accomplishing our goals utilizing the human resources that we have now, or are we shy on what we need? And then finally, number three, do we know how to measure progress? Do we really getting down and finding out what those output metrics are so we can really understand whether our folks are maturing? Are they becoming disciple makers themselves? And are we seeing the church, the global church of Jesus Christ, grow because of what's happening in our church and how it affects people near to us and far away? So, Scott, anything else to add for today's episode?
No, I just want to say, if you're listening to this episode and you're going, yeah, you know what? COVID really exposed my church and the flaws in my church and the gaps in our church. We don't do this very often on the podcast, but I really just want to mention this. Like, we can help you. That is literally why we exist. And we love to put out the podcast and to give training this way, but we have a process called strategic envisioning, and it's about helping your church become more effective at being a Great Commission church. That's what it is that we do. It's what we've done for years, and we've made significant changes and improvements to our process this year that, by God's grace, we were working on these things in January before we even knew what COVID-19 was. And before COVID-19 had a name, by the way. I don't think they had named it in January. And so I just want to put this out there. Like, if you're saying, man, I don't know what to do next. I don't know how to make a structure for question 1. I don't know how to engage leaders for question 2. I don't know what to measure, question 3. You should reach out to us. You should go to malfersgroup.com today, click on talk to a guide, and you'll end up talking to probably either me or AJ in all likelihood, and let us talk to you. Let us have a conversation with you about what's going on in your church and how we can help, because your church can change. Your church can improve. Your church can get better. There is a cure.
Yeah.
And it starts with the Great Commission.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, these enhancements that we've made have reduced the cost to a point in which no church would find it out of their reach at this point. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, you could have this happen in your church, and we would love to help you do that. As Scott said, malfersgroup.com is where you can find us. You can also just email us, leadership@malfersgroup.com. One of us will get that email and we'll get back in touch with you. And for today's episode, you can go to malfersgroup.com/48. It's episode number 48 for us, coming up on a year here pretty soon, Scott.
Yep.
And we would love to hear from you, talk about what's happening in your church and in your ministry. And we sure thank you for joining us today, and we'll be back with you next week again. Thanks.